Alright, good afternoon everyone. Today we will talk about human subjects research for clinical validation of pathogen detection devices. Again, my name is Nam Tran. I'm one of the postdoctoral fellows for our Point of Care Technology Center funded by the National Institute for Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. After this lecture, you will be able to understand the purpose of the Institutional Review Board, abbreviated as the IRB, understand the history underlying the creation of the IRB, be able to determine the level of IRB review based on the research risk. This is a helpful tool to know when you're applying for your own IRB approved protocol. Understand the requirements for IRB protocol submission. Be able to submit an IRB under special circumstances such as surveys, clinical trials, validation studies. And lastly, understand what an adverse event is and what to do when one occurs for interventional trials. We'll first start off with the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. The purpose of the IRB is to ultimately approve, review, and monitor biomedical and behavioral research involving humans. So if you're going to do anything in the human population, you have to pass through such a board before you can actually apply this research. The goal is to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects, and of course, the IRB was developed after many lessons learned over the course of history. This brings us to a little bit of historical background. During World War II, as you know, there were many crimes against humanity due to a variety of the Axis powers, Nazi Germany and so forth, which preempted the need for establishing the Nuremberg Code. This code, of course, was applied to the military tribunals to address the human experiments conducted by the Germans during World War II. This was in 1947. Over the course of that time, little did we know in the United States there was also an injustice being done against another population where in a study called the Tuskegee study occurring over 1932 to 1972, so over 40 years, physicians failed to treat patients appropriately. Specifically, these were African American patients who had syphilis. And the purpose was to observe how patients did, whether they were treated or not, for this infectious disease. Well, by 1974, we learned a little bit more and established what is called the National Research Act. They defined the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and required all funded research projects to have IRB approval and oversight from what is now known as the Department of Health and Human Safety, so HH&S. Well, in 1978, we have what is called the Belmont Report. It further augments what was already established by essentially finding that there are three principles that we must follow for human subject-based research. So the National Committee for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research submitted these three principles. First, respect for persons. Second, beneficence. And last but certainly not least, justice. And as you can see, this is definitely based off of many of the lessons learned over earlier in this century, in the 1900s. The first one, which respect for persons, is pretty much based on the recognition of personal dignity and autonomy of individuals and special protection for those persons named with diminished autonomy. What is that? Well, these are, for example, high-risk population or at-risk populations, such as children, diseased individuals, as well as prisoners, pregnant women, and so forth. So many of these things have to be outlined and identified so that you address the need to respect these individuals. Next, we have beneficence. It's our obligation as researchers to protect persons from harm by maximizing anticipated benefits and minimizing possible risks of harm. Like I said, the next item is justice. We must make sure that the benefits and burdens of research must be distributed fairly. So in the case of the Tuskegee study, treatment of the African American group was certainly required. Having given the actual historical background for developing the IRB, we now go into the IRB itself. We will look at the IRB review process, the components of the IRB committee, and the levels of review for human-based research. Let's first start off with the components of the IRB. And this is the IRB application that we would send in to the committee. The IRB requires that you identify a principal investigator, and for those of us in the research world, we all know what a principal investigator is, and essentially it's the person who's in charge of the study, the person responsible. These days they also require selection or identification of a co-PI in case the PI is somewhere else due to a variety of reasons, including medical leave. Some of the more important areas, however, include the research personnel list. This personnel list shows people who will consent patients, who will interact with patients at many levels for the research project. This includes the PI and the co-PI, and therefore it's important that these people not only are identified but also receive training in human-based research. There are some special requirements in this application. It includes identification of investigational drugs or devices. These require a special Food and Drug Administration approval. Specifically for the drugs, you need an IND, an investigational new drug exemption. For devices, it's called an IDE, investigational drug or investigational device exemption. These are of course very costly to research projects. Therefore, the INDs, for example, are done by pharmaceutical companies that have lots of money and have reached the appropriate stage for them to bring this drug into human clinical trials. Identification if the study is a survey or an interview is also required. These have different stringencies depending on the level of human contact and intervention. International research, advertisements, radiological materials, or cancer risks. The research subjects is also an important area. You have to clearly identify the number and type of research subjects. How many do you expect? How many adults? How many male or female? And so forth. It just really depends on the type of research, but you have to be very clear with what you are proposing. Another element is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. This focuses more on the protection of patient health information. So protected health information, abbreviated as PHIs, need to be addressed. We don't want our social security number, medical record number, and so forth to be spread across the world due to disclosing or not knowing that we're disclosing this patient health information. So therefore, we have to figure out a way and address HIPAA regulations by de-identifying or protecting or locking away these protected human information, health information. The bulk of the IRB will consist of the DOS, the description of study. So essentially this is your proposal, your protocol. So it talks about everything from procedures, risks, benefits, subject selection, and recruitment. It is our experience here at our center, the more details, albeit in a clear and concise manner, the better. Because many of the committee members may not be experts in what you do, so the better and more clear you are in explaining your project, the more likely your project will be successful in gaining an IRB approval. Speaking of IRB approval, our next slide shows the level of IRB review. There are 3 levels of IRB review. Number 1, going from most difficult, most rigorous to least rigorous. We have full committee review. These are the ones that are greater than minimal risk to the patient, so high risk. And the entire IRB committee essentially reviews this project. The IRB committee consists of many members at academia as well as from our community, including lawyers, your everyday person working outside of the healthcare profession who are interested in taking part of this, nurses, we have researchers, scientists, and so forth. There's a great mix, and therefore you can't expect these people to completely know what you're doing, and therefore, like I said in the previous slide, the more clearly and concisely and detail your description of your project is, the better that they can, the better your chances of success. Well, full committee review is very rigorous, and ultimately it takes about a month at minimum, but likely 2 to 3 months following various revisions that you have to do to address the concerns of the IRB committee. So therefore, it's good to plan ahead for these things. The next level of review, which is moderate in terms of turnaround time as well as rigorousness, is expedited review. These projects are usually considered low risk or minimal risk studies. The terminology varies between institutions, but what's usually adopted by the government is considered minimal risk. And in this case, it's a study that is reviewed by the IRB committee chair only. Of course, if the IRB committee chair cannot make a decision, they will bump it up to full committee review, so that could take longer. It's our experience that it takes about a month turnaround time to get expedited review completed. Of course, the word expedited implies it's faster. It's certainly faster compared to full committee review. Exemption essentially is based on no risk studies, like a survey, where you don't report patient information or so forth. And this is usually done by the IRB staff who have approval from the committee or even the committee chairs and so forth, and this ultimately is very quick. It could take about a week's turnaround time in a good case, but in our experience, once again, it takes about 2 weeks. And these studies, of course, are no risk to the population. Therefore, we can summarize the IRB review process with this figure. We submit the application. It can go one of 3 routes: exemption, expedite, full committee review. Let's first focus on exemption. In short, it goes through exemption. There might be revisions. You might have to start off and resend it again, and it can go through the process, and ultimately that's approved. It's pretty quick. Expedited, it goes through a process which can include just revisions and ultimate approval, could include revisions and then deferment to the full committee, or just go directly to full committee because the IRB chair could not make a decision. Full committee review, of course, will take longer, and there will be much backwards and forwards because these studies are usually for greater risk, has greater risk to the patient population. Therefore, they're going to ask you many questions to figure out what you're going to do, how are you going to address certain things, and so forth. And ultimately, after some rigorous processes, you'll get it approved and you can begin the study. Well, having said that, now that we have an IRB, we now focus on the process of informed consent, because you and I would not be a happy person if we decided to not take part in a study and no one listened to us and we were placed on a research study that could harm us. Regardless of harm and so forth, we have a nice process of informed consent, and this slide shows what's required. It requires training. Many institutions have incorporated this training. IRB training teaches us what you're learning here in this slideshow, of course in much greater detail, and it tells you what you should and should not do when consenting patients. For obvious reasons, you don't want to talk about a patient's medical history in an elevator. That's something that is both covered by the IRB training as well as HIPAA. And of course, HIPAA's primary focus is PHIs, Protected Health Informations. The frequency of training, many training programs are a one-shot deal. You essentially do it once and you're done for the rest of your stay at that institution. However, some government institutions require training regularly. So over the course of 3 years, the Department of Defense, for example, requires additional IRB training. And this was our experience with a recent DoD grant. Now, let's focus on the very important part, which is the informed consent process. I want to emphasize this is a process. It's not a one-time event. When you consent a patient for a clinical study, it's not that they sign off on that document and you are done with them and you don't have to come back to them. These people must be kept in the loop. They may have questions down the road. They may have questions after the study and so forth, and it's your job as the researcher to answer them. So informed consent is required for all studies not eligible for exemption. So the full committee review type studies are required to have consent. Adult patients, for example, must be consented directly. Pediatric patients in our case age less than 18 years, require both consent and formal assent from the pediatric patient. And assent is, of course, asking if the child is willing to take part in this study. For non-English speaking patients, the consent process is the same. However, you need a translator there as well as a translated and approved consent form to give to them. Incapacitated patients, of course, which are very real and they occur quite often in the intensive care units, you can consent using surrogate consent, and this is essentially using a legal representative that can answer for this patient while they are unable to respond to you. Following consent, you must provide the patient or their family member, if it's in the case of surrogate consent, with a copy. You must give a copy to the medical records if this is a patient population that's in the hospital, for example. And then you got to keep the original for yourself over this allowed amount of time after the duration of the study is over. Now, what's not on here, but it's worth mentioning, is waiver of consent. Normally, for studies that are so emergent that they require action and the treatment of the patient is more important than consenting them, waiver consent is possible. It requires notification or at least documentation to report to Health and Human Safety, the government level, and so forth. However, for other studies, it is acceptable to have waiver consent, which we found out where if you were to collect remnant samples, there's no need to consent the patient, or at least there's a way to work around it, because you don't need the patient information. You're just collecting a sample to test it blindly on a new device, for example. This next slide shows the informed consent checklist. These are the things that one must go through before we can say, yes, we've adequately consented this patient. Number one, we must discuss the purpose of the study with the patient very clearly and concisely. We need to describe the study procedures, identify the risk benefits of the study, ensure that all questions are answered, the subject themselves or even the surrogate has voiced understanding, and we've obtained signatures from the subject or surrogate, and for a surrogate, a witness must also co-sign as well. We also need contact information in the case where there are needs for additional questions from the patient. So we have to provide them with our number or email or whatever it may be, and provide copies for the research subject and records. And what we found is it's very important to not only clearly, concisely move through this, but we have to balance it with a efficient way of describing to the patients what's going on. From a personal standpoint, one would guess that in a critically ill population or a population that's very busy, people are in a rush because A, for the critical population, they want to see their family member for, let's say, for surrogate consent. Or they could be a very sick patient who can directly consent, but they're in so much pain and they're not doing too well, they just don't feel well talking to you. So you have to keep it as short as feasibly possible without compromising this checklist. For people who are outpatient clinics, we have to make sure that we're not rushing through this, but at the same time we can't be taking our time because many of these people probably have waited for a while and they now need to go off to work. So these things we need to consider so that we have both successful and adequate consenting of the patient population. Now for the last set of slides, I'll talk about case examples. This is from our own personal experience here at the Point Care Technology Center, and the first one is for our needs assessment survey. What happens if you need to determine the end user needs to develop a device? So you're going to send out a variety of paper-based or web-based surveys, and the objective is to assess the needs of clinical experts to provide guidance for development of these technologies. Well, the suggested IRB pathway here is by exemption. The requirements, however, to go this route are based on these categories shown here, and you must ensure that there's no direct link between the surveyee and the results. We don't want these results to compromise not only the person's identity but their jobs and so forth. Disclosure should not put the subject at risk of criminal or civil liability. So that just reinforces what I just said. And we cannot conduct activities where children are being observed. So it's rather interesting for these, but for our survey, it was very simple. All we had to do was assign a number to persons who took our survey, and that's it. We didn't really have to do much more than that. And their results, which just essentially said, this is the type of device that we want, this is the shape that we want, that's where we would go. Case number 2, assay validation. So what if you had a new technology that you needed to validate in the patient setting? In this case, we wanted to validate using spiked human samples such as blood collected from healthy volunteers, or use remnant samples. The suggested IRB pathway here is expedited review. However, it could go full committee review depending on how you write it and how the study is designed. Requirements: minimal risk study for samples collected prospectively. Retrospective samples may fall under the exempt category. This is a very interesting concept, that if you have samples that are left over from another study, you could technically use them and you will not require expedited or full committee review. However, a little caveat is these research, at least at our institution, these results are for internal use only. So therefore, you may not be able to publish the data if you were using from remnant samples. Case number 3, prospective observational clinical study. Our goal here is to just do a prospective observational trial in hospitalized patients. So it's a blinded study, blinded to the clinicians, and we're not intervening in any way, form, or manner. We're just collecting a sample, testing it, and then recording it, and after the fact we would kind of then make a correlation to what happened to the patient if this test were to be used for interventions. This is a full committee review, so it's going to take you about 2 to 3 months. Informed consents required. Patient groups must be identified in detail, including both inclusion and exclusion criteria. Protection of patient information must be described in also detail, and therefore you need to ensure that these people get random numbers assigned to them and so forth, and documents are de-identified. Case example number 4, interventional clinical trial. You're now going to treat these patients with whatever you have. So let's say we have a new pathogen detection system, and these results will be used for patient care. It's obviously going to be full committee review. Consent is of course required. Patient groups must be described in detail, again with inclusion and exclusion criteria, along with protection of patient information. A data safety monitoring board is required, and case report forms must also be approved. So this now brings us to special considerations for this actual process. What happens if you have a patient population where it kind of is in the middle of where it's not emergent enough, not an emergency where you can waive consent, but at the same time you have a disease which may occur, may or may not occur, and you need to catch it, consent them before it actually occurs so you get adequate data. We found that a blanket consent actually works well. This was potentially one of the first times at UC Davis a blanket consent was approved. And in short, we described a patient recruitment scheme that had adequate inclusion and exclusion criteria. If the patient manifests the signs of this disease, a sample would be collected. If they never manifested the signs of this certain disease, they would just be deemed as screening failures at the time of their discharge from the hospital. So no harm, no foul to them. We just continue to move on and continue recruiting until we get a patient that does get that disease. And this works very well. And we found this to be our standard now for a variety of studies, and we've been using it on at least 3 or 4 studies now, and it's very efficient and everyone pretty much understands on how it works. We now also have are fortunate enough to have a study that requires a data safety monitoring board. It's an interventional trial, and the data safety monitoring board, as I mentioned, is required for such studies. And the roles and responsibilities of the DSMB, as is shown here, is first, be responsible for periodic review and evaluation of study data for participant safety, study conduct, and when appropriate, efficacy. This is required for all clinical trials. The operation, of course, is that the DSMB must meet before the clinical trial, then meet periodically for the duration of the study, and make recommendations to modify, continue, or terminate the trial. Membership on the DSMB includes clinical experts in the disease and patient population, a biostatistician, and these people cannot be directly related to the study. Conflict of interest, of course, as shown there, they can't be a part of this study, and therefore these people ultimately identify, they meet during these frequent time periods and identify, is this study causing more harm than good? Or is this study causing too much good that it's not worthwhile to put patients under a clinical trial anymore, and this study should now go into the mainstream? Or is this study just not having or not making any difference? So these components must be addressed, and they make recommendations to the principal investigator of the study in parallel to the IRB. So you must ultimately listen to the DSMB regardless, because they're usually the ones that will communicate with the Institutional Review Board. And one of the biggest things that we are concerned about, both as a DSMB but also as PIs and researchers, are adverse events. Definition of an adverse event is any change in health or side effect that occurs in a person who participates in a clinical trial while the patient is receiving a treatment over or within a pre-specified period of time after their treatment has been completed. It is our role, at least at UC Davis, to report adverse events within 5 days of the investigator becoming aware of such an event. This includes contacting the IRB and also the DSMB. So these are very important. There are, of course, adverse events, serious adverse events, and unanticipated adverse events. And all are relatively obvious. We know an adverse event is defined above. A serious adverse event, of course, is much more serious. And unanticipated adverse events are something that are just, that came out more or less of left field. And a good example of an unanticipated adverse event would be death. So we don't like those happening, but they do happen sometimes in various clinical trials. We're now going to close out with first IRB submission tips for future investigators and so forth. Number one, and most important, is plan ahead. Always assume considerable lead time for these processes. You never know what the committee is going to bring up, and of course they're very important feedback. They're coming from a different perspective than you are, and it's important to address these clearly because they do represent the populations, and it's the population that you are going to do research in. So therefore, plan between 1 to 3 months ahead. 3 months, the more the better. Check your certifications annually. You never know. Some people, you have new staff, you have staff that require to redo their training for IRB and HIPAA. It could change because you're sending a document to the Army. Get site approval. If you're going to do a study in another unit outside your department or even in your department, get their approval. You do not want to have a unit director, unit chief wonder why you are here and who allowed you to come in here, and they don't care if you have IRB approval or not. That will get the investigator in very serious trouble. The easiest way to get around this is to essentially have the actual unit director, service chief, or whatever it is, be a part of the study. That is, be a co-investigator and so forth. And if they're on the IRB, the better. If not, then have them write a letter for inclusion on your protocol. Another important component is be descriptive in your description of study. Like I said, you need to be clear and concise, but also be detailed. Don't keep things away because you think it's going to cause you more problems. Just word it in a way that won't get the applicant in trouble. Remember that the IRB audience includes scientists, physicians, lawyers, college students, and members of the community. Not many people may be experts in what you are doing. Next, work with the committee. These people are here to help you. It's a service. It's not a hurdle or a roadblock. I have found personally that working with the committee, including the chairs, will help get you to expedite the process much more quickly and less of a headache to you, the applicant. And I found our chairs here very, very helpful. Well, in summary, the human research subject protection is a product of many lessons learned from history, all the way back to World War I or World War II. Policies exist to protect the rights of the research subjects. The IRB provides oversight for any human subjects related study. Informed consent is a process. Remember, it's a process, and it's required for studies which use patient medical information and or has a low to high risk. Blanket consent is useful for consenting patients which exhibit a time-dependent disease or condition. So you can't wait for it, essentially. However, the inclusion and exclusion criteria must be defined very clearly. And that's essentially it. Thank you very much for your time.